Hello, this is Donovan Frazier from the Modern Southeast Asia course. In this documentary, I will analyze primary sources to answer the question, how did World War II impact Vietnam and the Philippines, and specifically their nationalist movements? At this time period, both states were possessions of colonial powers. For Vietnam, it was part of the French Indochina colony, whereas with the Philippines, it was a commonwealth underneath the American government. Both countries had nationalist aspirations. With Vietnam, the future looked uncertain. Nationalist leaders such as Pham Boi Chau were attempting to spread Confucian nationalist ideas by sending youth abroad to foreign countries such as Japan for education. Ho Chi Minh was in France at the same time attempting to speak to world leaders after the conclusion of World War I. He was attempting to speak at the Paris Peace Conference to discuss independence, but didn't get an audience with world leaders, not yet at least. A decade later, and thousands of miles away, the Philippines looked as though they were about to be granted their independence. This was because Nacionalistas leader, President Manuel Quezon, was discussing with the American Congress over independence of the Philippines. The oligarchs and estados successfully discussed with the American government the Tidy-McDuffie Act and the Jones Act. These two acts would grant the Philippines independence after a 10-year transition period, which would have ended in 1944. I say would have because this did not actually pan out the same way it was intended because of World War II. World War II caused a heavy shift in nationalism in both countries. In the case of the Philippines, the United States government actually rolled back independence talks and instead saw strategic interest in having military bases still in the Philippines, especially on the northern islands such as Luzon. Having bases in the north was seen as a power projection of the United States, whereas having bases in the south, according to some critics, especially socialists, would have been the better defensive option, but the United States did not take that approach. When the invasion of the Philippines came hours after Pearl Harbor was attacked, the bases were quickly overrun by Japanese forces, and the Americans were sent in retreat. The oligarchs who had sided with the American government turned and sided with Japan. Some such figures were Jose Ponciano Larrell. He was the president of the Philippines during the Japanese occupation, and some of his forces, such as the police in Manila, were working with the Japanese military. During the occupation, the People's Army, known as the Huks, would fight a war against Japan. Because the government of the Philippines was seen as a puppet government by both the Americans and the Japanese at this point, the People's Army would fight as their own faction against the Japanese. But also later on, after the war, they would also fight the federal government of the Philippines as well. And this point would be known as the Huk Rebellion. It should be noted that even though after World War II had ended, the Huks, who originally did side with the Americans during the war, would side against the Americans after the war, and the oligarchs who had sided with Japan would then side with the Americans as well. This is to point out the complexity of the situation, because the People's Army and the oligarchs, even though they had both sided with the Americans at points, did not necessarily side with each other. And because they were both nationalist factions, they were in opposition of each other as well. For Vietnam, Vichy France, who was a puppet state of Nazi Germany, had handed over the entire Indochina colony to the Japanese government. During this time, France was technically on the side of Japan because of the Vichy France puppet state, but the French were largely out of the picture, and the Viet Minh, who were nationalist forces underneath Ho Chi Minh, would see this as an opportunity to take power in Vietnam. The Viet Minh did receive help from the American OSS, but largely Vietnam was out of the picture of the Pacific Theater during the war. At the end of the war, Japan signed surrender on September 2nd, 1945, and on this same day, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh forces in the north around Hanoi took hold of Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi, and Ho Chi Minh would give his speech on the Declaration of Independence for Vietnam.
Hỡi đồng bào cả nước, tất cả mọi người đều sinh ra có quyền bình đẳng, tạo hóa cho họ những quyền không ai có thể xâm phạm được.
He would quote the American Declaration of Independence and the French Rights of Man to justify this independence of Vietnam. which coincidentally were the two imperialist powers attempting to stop Ho Chi Minh's independence movements and his nationalism shortly after his declaration of independence. In the Philippines, at the end of World War II, there was a transition from a colonial state to a client state. This was not the same type of independence that Manuel Quezon was arguing for. Because of this, a rebellion with the People's Army against the government of the Philippines was started, with the argument being that the Philippine government was still a colonial puppet state of the Americans. This rebellion would last through the presidencies of Manuel Rojas and Ramon Poncese, and this rebellion would have a maximum force of about 12,000 fighters in central Luzon, though it has been noted that they have never had enough weapons to really support all of these fighters. In the years immediately following World War II, both countries would be involved in civil wars. For the Philippines, their civil war would last about 5 years and would have far less fighting and destruction than the civil war that would take place in Vietnam. In the Philippines, the Huks, or the People's Army, had used the momentum that they have gained from World War II to build up their strength in rebellion against the federal government. However, the rebellion was crushed by the same oligarchs who had still held power long since the days of the Spanish colonialism or even earlier. With Vietnam, there was a long series of battles against imperialist powers as well as other nationalist leaders. Two of the biggest factions that the Vietnamese government, who would later become the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, opposed the National Liberation Front, interestingly enough, where leaders such as Nguyen Thi Binh were integrated into the government of the northern government as a way of consolidating the North's power, much like the days of Minh Mang. And the most well-known nationalist faction, the Republic of Vietnam, would have a 20-year civil war, of which they would eventually be consolidated into the North. In the long picture, World War II was used as an opportunity by the nationalist leaders to take power in Vietnam and to assert themselves as a new faction to create a new Vietnam, not like the original Confucian government of like Minh Mang or earlier or later emperors. In this sense, World War II for the nationalists in Vietnam gained a bit more power, whereas with the Philippines, the nationalist leaders like Manuel Quezon actually lost some power, though they were not entirely powerless. As a result, there was a rollback of independence talks. So in this way, both countries had opposite impacts by World War II on their nationalist factions. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this documentary has been informative. The leaders of the People's Army, such as Luis Tarek, would be arrested at the end of the rebellion in 1954 and would be sentenced to prison. However, in his particular scenario, he was pardoned by later President Ferdinand Marcos in 1968.